Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Julie Bindel, journalist, author, veteran women's rights campaigner. We spoke about Julie's experience of feminist activism over the decades, clashes within feminism based on class, clashes between gay men and lesbian women, including during the AIDS crisis. And in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about the child prostitution gangs that have operated in Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oxford, and elsewhere in the UK, and Julie's work as a journalist and campaigner in bringing these atrocities to light. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the MMM chat community, and also the whole back catalogue of extended episodes. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Julie, I want to start by talking about the Lesbian Project. Was it a think tank? Is that the right term for it?
Kind of like a less elite, less stuffy think tank, because I think now the image of a think tank is actually quite elite. So we're a project that wants to fill a gap in knowledge and policy and advocacy. So yeah, it's like a think tank.
And you've got the podcast as well with Kathleen Stock about all things lesbian related.
All things lesbian related, and we decided to do it because we wanted to engage with subscribers who have any kind of broad interest in the lives of lesbians, the well-being of lesbians, the gaps in knowledge, in advocacy and research. And we thought, well, if we did a podcast, we'd reach many of those women, and there's no requirement to be a lesbian. We have male subscribers, which is great, and they have an interest in the broad human rights aspects of anti-lesbian discrimination as it relates to other forms of discrimination and exclusion. And we figured that it would make what we're doing more accessible. We also disagree on quite a lot of things, Kathleen and I, and that always makes for an interesting discussion because we have a set of core beliefs. I mean, the term values has been so compromised, I think, for me in recent years. We can maybe get to that later, but we agree on some important issues, which is why we're friends and colleagues, but we also really don't on other things. And so having that conversation about it, as well, I think just helps us work out why we've reached particular conclusions or why we're thinking about things along the way. And we still haven't decided exactly what our position is on things.
At the risk of stating the obvious, I'm guessing that your feeling in setting up the Lesbian Project was that existing LGB and LGBT organisations were not filling this gap in terms of knowledge and advocacy relating to lesbians.
Yes, so there's 2 levels of this. For as long as I can remember, and I've been an out lesbian since, the 1970s, and very conscious about, I suppose, the politics and reality of lesbian lives since not long after that when I met feminists. It's been clear that in lesbian and gay groups, gay men will always dominate. Their issues will dominate. Their voices will dominate. I mean, if we go right back to before my time as an activist, in the early 1970s, when the gay liberation movement was formed, and that was pretty equal between lesbians and gay men, almost all of the lesbians walked out further down the line after about 5 years because they could no longer take the sexism, either unconscious or very blatant sexism, of many of the gay men, and realised that actually they needed, and we still do need, an autonomous movement that serves the needs of women as opposed to men, because of course lesbians are women and gay men are men, or at least that's the old-fashioned version. Anyway, there's that level, which is why we need to disentangle ourselves from lesbian and gay, which had become all one word. And now, of course, there's the new level of gender identity and the attack on the definition of same-sex attraction, which is, of course, what lesbians are. There's the invasion of queer-identified, trans-identified males into dating apps, physical spaces, and quite frankly, our heads, in the way that we are being conditioned and bullied, particularly young lesbians, to accept these men within our communities, either because they masquerade as lesbians or because we're all supposed to be one big happy rainbow family. So lesbians will always lose out. We're the first letter in the LGBTQI A2 Spirit Plus ever-growing unbreakable Wi-Fi code. And we are the least well-served. So we need to do it for ourselves in the time-honoured tradition of women getting on and just doing it.
And what would you say are top one or two issues where lesbian women have distinct needs or complaints or just issues relating to them that don't really get a hearing?
I think the specific forms of anti-lesbian discrimination, which is, of course, rooted in just a type of misogyny. It's kind of a misogyny on steroids, where women who have broken the code have rejected men sexually, because, of course, we're the only sexual orientation that reject men sexually. We can come in for an awful lot of violence, abuse, and marginalisation. And it's different from homophobia, from the kind of abuse that gay men get. And certainly we're concerned about that. And we wish that that would end. This isn't any kind of hierarchy of oppression, but it is absolutely clear that for women it is harder to come out as a lesbian, as it is to come out as a gay man in almost all circumstances and contexts. And I think the second thing is the way that we organise our families. And for many lesbians, of course, we have children or we are involved in the care of children. And it's very hard to ensure that the bigotry towards us doesn't impact adversely on children in schools, in friendship groups, and the like. So they're two really big issues. And the other thing I think that we need to always be mindful of is that in the workplace for lesbians, often we don't feel able to come out, and often there's sexual harassment of a particular type. And that can be, it's intolerable for any woman that faces that. But I think that sometimes if a particular kind of man gets any inkling that you are rejecting his advances because you may be a lesbian, then this can push women further back in the closet.
Are you also concerned? I mean, it's a difficult one to sort of do anything about, right? Certainly not at a legislative level, but it is very striking how many fewer younger women are identifying as lesbians, right? Because they're either transitioning or they're identifying as non-binary or something. And it was already, I think, a long-established thing, correct me if I'm wrong, that women tended to come out later than men. And now there's even more reticence, it seems, at least to be using the word lesbian because of different vocabulary or whatever. But it just seems as if there's a crisis of identification, I suppose.
Yes, and one of the things that surprised me when I was researching my previous book on feminism was how many young women in the LGBTQ plus type organisations in universities, so largely we're talking about middle class women, almost all upper middle class women, who were the problem, who were bullying and censoring other women who wanted to use the term lesbian. And, we could argue till the cows come home about whether or not these women were doing it to please men because they were scared that they'd be punished if they didn't toe the line. Or, and certainly these women exist in their droves, they are women who just see themselves as not needing feminism, not needing lesbian liberation politics, not needing to see themselves as part of a sex class of women or a group of lesbians that have a special interest. But they just see themselves as individuals that don't need anyone to fight on their behalf. And so they've adopted this very kind of neoliberal approach to life. And anyone that diverts away from their truth, from what they see as a fact, which is that we're all queer, and the word lesbian denotes transphobia, then they will just impose that. And they won't think critically about any of it. And so many of the women who were causing the problems for young lesbians who didn't want to use the word or who were scared of using the word, they're other women. And then, of course, as you rightly point out, often women come out later in life. Maybe women will be more swayable into a heterosexual life that they really weren't sure about at all, with a man who they really weren't that connected to, with a sexuality that she hadn't had the opportunity to express or to even admit to herself. She finds herself married or in some kind of heterosexual coupling, and then later on her unhappiness will get the better of her and she'll live her life as she wants to live her life. But that brings its own problems. And of course, there's some pretty nasty bullying coming from some lesbians who consider themselves to be gold star lesbians. So they're the authentic lesbians. They've never been heterosexual. They consider themselves to be born that way. I mean, as if any baby should be ascribed a sexuality or a sexual attraction is just crazy. As though women who have had a heterosexual past and then meet a woman and fall in love or just decide that this is their preference are inauthentic. At best can call themselves bisexual, they say. They're not true lesbians. So it's nasty bullying coming from some, I would call them essentialist lesbians, the born that way crew. And then on the other hand, there is some awful bullying coming from the queer crowd.
I can't help but, I mean, just hearing about the ways in which lesbian politics is driven by class differences and political differences, whatever, much like feminism, right? I mean, it recalls exactly the same sort of schisms which are eternal, really, within feminism, and which, because you've been involved in feminist work for such a long time, that you've seen for such a long time. I mean, talk to me more about some of the class clashes in British feminism over the decades, because it seems as if all this queer stuff is just maybe the newest manifestation of some of that.
I think you're right. When I first became involved in feminism, I was just turning 18. I was living in West Yorkshire, where there was a very vibrant women's liberation movement. I mean, the real deal. I mean, these women were uncompromising. There was no liberal kind of, as Andrea Dworkin put it, the fun kind of feminism tolerated. It was that you were in or you were out. And if you were in, then what that meant was that you were concerning yourself with the key issues, the one issue that faces women all over the world. The only issue, I would argue, that all women share, which is the fear and reality of men's violence. And of course, the Feminist Project was to challenge, to speak out about, and to end male violence. And so that was what bonded us. That was the glue that held us together. But within that, there were some huge differences that for a time we didn't really pay attention to. And the result of that was a horrific emergence of, and which ended up dominating the entire movement, and I think quite frankly ending that phase of the movement, identity politics, where it was your identity that carried more weight in an argument or a disagreement than your opinion. For example, meetings that started with speaking as a Black lesbian mother, speaking as a working class Irish woman. And this went on. And it was so ludicrous that often whole meetings were taken up with the announcement of one's identity and depression, or otherwise it was speaking as a white, privileged, able-bodied. I mean, it just was intolerable. And I think the reason why little was said prior to that explosion of identity politics about differences was that women had come together for the first time in a conscious effort to defeat patriarchy, to say there is something called patriarchy, there's something called the oppression of women. Women are a sex class, we're all sisters, and that's all that matters. Well, of course, that isn't all that matters. You know, some of the other things matter, and I hate it when anti-feminists use what the differences between women to try to divide us, because actually ultimately we do share something very concrete. But of course it matters if you're an uneducated working class woman who is surrounded by those in the movement who have one or even more degrees, and who can quote Foucault at you, and who've read all of the feminist literature, and who speak about theory in meetings where you're just there as a young scrap of a kid from a housing estate with no clue what they're talking about. You know, this mattered. It mattered when there were Black women coming into the movement who were saying, well, we can't do things like that because the communities in which we are embedded, that's impossible. And it was, well, we're all women together. I don't see what you're complaining about. I mean, that's putting it very crudely and paraphrasing, because of course we were, if we think about the rest of the left as it was then and as it is now, feminists actually cared a damn sight more about race and racism and class prejudice than any leftist men or any other leftist groups ever did. But I think class became the issue that was forgotten and still is. So what we've got now, of course, is a dominance of upper middle class spoilt brats, in my view, who have been told that they are the centre of their own universe by their parents, who just ignore the fact that they're wrapped in some kind of gold-laced cotton wool, and that they'll never end up in prison. Why should they worry about Karen White, the trans-identified male rapist? You know, they'll never end up needing a domestic violence refuge. Why the hell should they concern themselves with men targeting women in rape crisis shelters? So they see themselves as being the ones. I think the way that I see these people who respond to our concerns about men in women's spaces as those very privileged people in extremely wealthy areas of the country, holding up signs that say, asylum seekers, migrants, we welcome you, we want you here, which is, to me, virtue signalling in the extreme when they are doing it next door to a run-down housing estate in Dublin, where working class people are the ones that bear the brunt of having a load of extra people dumped on them, and that these people complaining about that are not racists. They are not concerned in the slightest bit that the people that are taking up their spaces in doctors' surgeries or the queue for housing are brown or black skinned. They are concerned that they are being treated just as fodder. And the virtue signallers will always refuse to accept that it affects them in any way. So that's the analogy for me. And I think that we've ignored class in feminism at our peril, because as you've pointed out, Louise, what we've got now is this absolute lunacy coming from elite institutions, whether it's universities, publishing, and the like, that there's no chance of working class women getting jobs in there and daring to speak out about using pronouns in their email sign off.
I've always cheekily thought that a proposal that would really get up the nose of the sort of the virtue signal as you describe is if we said, okay, so we've got an issue with housing asylum seekers, overwhelmingly young men. I know, why don't we put bunk beds in university accommodation? And I know you also don't believe that men and women exist. So how about your undergraduate daughters bunk up, What's the problem? What's the
Right.
problem? Please explain the problem
I
too.
like
Right?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should put together
There
a
we go. Get
proposal.
it on the Labour Party
Yeah.
manifesto. Yeah. Do you think that this is also a big factor in prostitution not just having fallen off the feminist agenda, but actually having been actively promoted by so many feminists?
Yes, prostitution is a class issue. It's also, as you know, an issue of the most disenfranchised women, whether they are having been through the care system, whether they are raised middle class, who have the misfortune to meet a pimp, whether they're Indigenous women in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand, who are marginalised and where violence within those communities is just so normalised. It is an issue about poverty, about race, about all manner of issues, as well as, of course, misogyny and the male sex right. And it's quite staggering to me that any feminist, genuine feminist, not the ones that pretend to be, not the ones that just use the word in order to bash feminists and have some kind of authority when they do it, but any actual feminist could think that some women are just a vessel for men's sexual aggression and sexual need and desire and frustration. But that some women, of course, should be protected from that. And academics are some of the worst offenders in this. Some of the female academics that started using the term sex work, call men who run brothels managers, call men who abuse women for money clients. It's an obscenity when they are literally looking at a group of women for whom choice is that or something equally desperate, maybe not quite as dangerous, that is something acceptable, and that they also have this idea. And how can they be feminists if they think this? That men have an uncontrollable urge that they have to satisfy, or they will go out and rape real women, other women. That's their language. That's their inference, not mine. When they don't think that rape is something natural, they would be appalled if they heard a woman in one of their seminars say, well, all men are potential rapists. These women promoting sex work are not the extreme separatist, constantly angry women who call all men rapists. These women see themselves as reasonable feminists. And yet they somehow think that this uncontrollable male desire has to be inflicted upon only a certain group of women. And I remember, I think it was Jack Kerouac, one of the 60s beat. I can't remember the genre, but anyway, Jack Kerouac, one of those kind of anti-establishment poets, writers of the time, in the 60s published something in which there was a scene where a man and woman driving past a country lane saw a man raping a woman on the roadside. And the woman jumped out of the car and shouted, don't do that. You don't need to. You can have me. Have me. And it's this idea that rape is somehow, and I include prostitution in this, that you can somehow just have volunteer auxiliaries so that men can actually do this to women. And some women will volunteer for this. No woman would volunteer for this. The women in prostitution are in its extreme form, in its most blatant and raw form, being abused in front of our eyes by unbridled toxic masculinity. And yet, these academics who think they're progressive think that something like this should occur in a civilized society. It's beyond belief. It took us long enough to get feminists to appreciate, back in the early days, that prostitution was not just something that a group of women did that we don't understand. They're almost kind of born into it. It took a long time for feminists to understand that prostitution and its sister, pornography, were expressions of and a route to misogyny and male violence. And now look what's happened. Traitors, every single woman who refers to this as sex work and thinks that we shouldn't put the onus on men paying for sex rather than women, every one of those are traitors.
Tell me more about some of these early days of trying to persuade feminists to care about this. I mean, so the sex wars are in what, the 80s-ish? Is that when it's really, that's when you have the clashes between Dworkin and McKinnon and so on? Is that also the era, Julie, when you and other British feminists are going around gluing the keyholes of pawn shops in Soho and stuff?
That was happening, and it wasn't just in Soho. Obviously, it was in cities all over the world, and all of us were busy that night whenever that was happening. But it was obviously direct action, which is a great part of feminism, and has been, as we know, from the early suffragists and suffragette days. But no, it started before the so-called sex wars, which were a little bit further on, sort of 86, 87. Maybe a bit earlier than that in the UK. Started already in the US. I remember going to the US in 1985 when sadomasochism and porn for lesbians, in inverted commas, was being peddled as liberationary. And it was very much a kind of borrowed culture from gay men's sexuality and sexual practice. And represented the
at the peak of AIDS as well. So sorry to interrupt, but during AIDS, it's interesting that would be a kind of a transference from gay to lesbian culture.
I think that's right. And gay men had very different priorities than we did. Gay men would be arrested for sex in public spaces. Often the police were setting up gay men to be arrested. I mean, there were some terrible things happening, but quite frankly, I didn't want, an 11-year-old boy that I knew going into a public loo and finding two leather queens shagging each other in public. I didn't want to walk past it in the park and see it. Gay men tell me this became part of their culture because, of course, sex between men was criminalised until 67, but after that it wasn't. So just get out of the parks and get out of the public loos. If that's your quest for liberation, then quite frankly, we have different versions of liberation. But what was happening in gay male discourse, and I mean apolitical gay men, I don't mean the gay men that were actually fighting the systems and speaking about what a liberated life for gay men would look like. They were talking about how terrible it was that the bathhouses in San Francisco, which is where I went in 1985 and found all this lesbian porn and sadomasochism, they were talking about how outrageous it was that bathhouses were closed down because this gay cancer, as it was called at the time, was spreading, and they had to curb the infection, and they could no longer have be left alone by police when they had back rooms in leather bars to have sex, and so on and so on. And so it was a very, very in-your-face, blatant sexuality where gay men were talking about, consuming masses more porn so that there was less direct sexual contact between men that were concerned about infecting each other. And then that did kind of really spill over into so much of lesbian community, because many lesbians, when the AIDS crisis emerged, just dropped everything and ran to support gay men. Now, it's valiant, all right? This was a terrible, awful, unspeakable thing that gay men went through, either because they were directly affected by AIDS and HIV, as most were, either personally or through their friendship circles and communities, or because of the things that were said about gay men in the press, in society in general. It was awful. But it's interesting, isn't it, that so many lesbians ran towards this crisis and held the hands of gay men throughout, gave blood, mopped their brows, liaised with their families, did these valiant, wonderful things that gay men have never, ever, ever done for lesbians. And you could say that's because there has never been a plague that has affected lesbians. But there is something called male violence. There's something called rape and domestic abuse. There's something what's called being scared to walk down the street because there's crowds of men threatening you and being sexually harassed at work. Lesbians are women, and women face this constantly. We are saturated in pornography wherever the hell we look. Gay men have as a group been quite pro pornography. Lesbians, less so now, of course, but certainly when lesbianism and feminism were indivisible, been critical of porn because it's harmful to women, we argue. And so we've been on very opposite sides of the tracks with gay men in terms of sexuality and sexual practice. But during the AIDS crisis, that kind of broke down, and gay male culture really bled into lesbian culture, partly because of the money as well. The pornographers, could see that there's money to be made, and if lesbians are buying it, then they're selling it. And partly because I think that we became lesbian and gay, all one word, and that was partly because of the solidarity shown from many, many, many lesbians towards gay men at the time. And that kind of lesbian and gay, all one word, never went away. They just added more and more groups of queer identified men onto it.
Did lesbians actually really consume that much porn, though? I mean, I originally called my first book Playgirls because that was are you familiar with this? This was supposed to be the equivalent of Playboy magazine, but for women with male models. And it was a massive flop. The women weren't interested at all. It ended up being bought and consumed by gay men. Did the same sort of thing happen where, yes, you might talk the talk on being liberated on porn, but actually women just aren't that interested in the end?
Definitely. Yeah. Some lesbians, of course, will watch porn. Some lesbians, I wrote a piece not that long ago for Unheard magazine that you also write for, and it was about, the myth of lesbian porn. There is no lesbian porn for lesbians. Some lesbians will consume porn. Lesbians are more likely, if they do consume porn, and they're a minority, to consume gay male porn. The theory is because there's women removed, there's less sexism. Who knows? I don't get it. But yeah, there are some lesbians who will consume porn. There are some straight women who will consume porn. The women I've spoken to have said that the heterosexual women, that they are introduced to porn through their sexual partners, their boyfriends, their husbands. For lesbians, who knows? Maybe everything's online now, including dating apps, and things have changed, and that porn is so easily and readily available. But pornographers know that they can't make money from lesbians. We're too small a demographic, and not enough of us consume it. And if we do, not on a regular basis. And going back to the 80s, pre-internet, that was also the case with published material and with video. So there was a magazine called Quim, which is apparently some Latin word for cunt. Who knows? I mean, some Latin word for some other Latin word. And a group of women who called themselves lesbians at the time, they probably would be trans men now or queer, decided that they would be producing this for lesbians. It lasted about 5 minutes, hardly anyone bought it. And then there was a magazine, and I always thought this was nasty, nasty stuff. It was called On Our Backs, again by these lesbian pornographers. And the reason why I thought it was particularly nasty was it was parodying Off Our Backs, which was a second wave, early women's liberation movement newsletter, magazine stapled together, the physical kind of copy of one of those old newsletters, which challenged men's violence. It was called Off Our Backs for that reason. And so to actually turn that around and say, now we want to be on our backs, and just pissing on what women who are desperately trying to stop women being raped and abused just for fun. I mean, it was just horrible. And so again, that didn't really last that long. There was a big scene which fizzled out of S&M dykes, as they call themselves, and they used to wear leather. Some of them even wore parodies of Nazi regalia, Nazi caps. The black leather was kind of interesting when you think about that. Used to carry around whips, lead their girlfriends on a dog leash with them crawling on all fours, thinking that this was liberatory, thinking that this would be a form of therapy for women who'd had sexual abuse earlier in their lives, to kind of face it head on and say, fuck you to the male abusers, we'll turn it around, we'll reclaim it. It was awful. And yeah, that there were the lesbian sex wars. Is porn liberating for women? Is leading your lover around on a leather leash liberating? Is producing porn in which you set fire to your lover, which is one of the episodes of, I think, On Our Backs. I mean, just horrible stuff. And of course, to critique that, we were, and we still are, as you well know, labelled anti-sex, which is about as logical as my friend, the anti-porn campaigner and author Gail Dines says. To say that we are anti-sex because we're anti-porn is like saying we're anti-food because we're anti-McDonald's. And I think that's a great analogy, because of course we're not. And how can you be pro-sex when you are getting off on the worst form of humiliation? Isn't that just sadism? Isn't that actually a million miles away from what sexual pleasure is supposed to be? The mutuality and the consent, the enthusiastic participation. So it made no sense to me then, and it makes no sense to me now, although I do understand it better now, I think.
I was writing a piece about Andrea Dworkin recently, and so I was revisiting some of the, it's not been published yet, revisiting some of the sex wars writing from the time. And it's the same cohort, really, isn't it? It's the same division that we're seeing now still around
Absolutely.
prostitution and porn, but also around trans and stuff. It's the same basic division between what Dworkin will call the feminist, not the fun kind, right? And I mean, I don't know what to call them kindly, but feminists who do take a very different view of all of this, and I guess see personal freedom as the crucial thing, which means that they, for instance, think that one's right to do sex work or whatever is a key feminist goal.
You're absolutely right. And I'm really interested to read your piece on Andrea Dworkin. She was the person, so I met her in 1996 and spent, considerable amounts of time with her over the years. And she was the one that taught me that actually it's fine to think that some women are utter scumbags. We still don't want them to be treated appallingly by men. We still don't want any one of them to be raped. We still do not think any one of them should be in prostitution or pornography. Some women are absolute shitheads, and that's fine. And as another friend of mine said to me very early on in my feminism days, if oppression made you a nice person, there'd be something to be said for it, right? So when I look at these so-called sex wars, there are some women who just went along with it because they were maybe working class women who felt excluded from feminism. And I get that. There were times when I clung on by my bare fingernails because I felt I can't relate to these women in many ways. It's great when we're talking about what to do to end male violence, but when I go to their house and they look at me like I've just kicked their puppy because I asked what an aubergine is, or hadn't read whichever feminist theoretical tome they were reading. Anyway, I get that some women felt really excluded, were rebellious, and decided to do a fuck you to feminists because they looked at us and thought we were all middle class elitists. And I get that. I understand it. And I understand it more, actually, in looking back. I wish that I had been able to speak out more about it at the time rather than further down the line. But there's a particular woman called Nettie Pollard, who has always been full on, full throttle sex work. Pornography's great. Gay men's sexuality is fabulous. You know, it's the best of anything I've ever seen. She's an actual supporter of the paedophile information exchange. She supported them at the time of the NCCL, which became Liberty. You'll know the scandal, and you'll be easily Google it, anyone that's listening to this, where these men argued that they were a repressed, oppressed sexual minority. They were non-practicing. I think they even called themselves paedophiles. They had sexual interest in children, prepubescent children, and that they should be protected alongside lesbians and gay men. And some of the NCCL shamefully supported them. And this was the beginning of the queer invasion of the lesbian and gay liberation movement, where it was, yeah, I'm an oppressed minority too. Nettie Pollard encompasses everything to do with that movement. And she's very unashamedly supportive of every single one of these. She would call them sexual minorities, and I would call them abusive scumbags. So, yeah, they're the same people.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, the paedophile thing is a real. It's where the rubber hits the road with this movement, isn't it? Because actually, it is a logical conclusion from the this basic idea of prioritizing sexual freedom above everything, and that having non-conventional sex is like innately good, and all of this, like and there and it's been largely forgotten, hasn't it, the fact that there was so much really quite open advocacy for paedophilia from all sorts of fancy people, Foucault on down. The paedophile information exchange was a real political force, and that's sort of been forgotten because there was a backlash against it, and it was. But I don't think you can help but end up with those conclusions if you're running with those priors.
I think you're right, and one of the most severe pylons I've experienced was when I said this on some media platform, and I wrote about it, and I wrote about this and Peter Tatchell's complicity in the normalisation of adult male sex with children back in 2001 in a column in The Guardian about, gay men have to speak out against this normalisation of sex with boys. I don't really care if your narrative is that you were 9 and you got a stiffy when your uncle sexually abused you. That, how dare you translate that into it's fine for adult men to touch the genitals and sexually abuse 9-year-old boys. I mean, it's just the weirdest, illogical, and also self-serving, grotesque argument. I don't use the term paedophile because I think it medicalises what is behaviour that some men choose to either go along with or perpetrate themselves. I mean, the men that look for sites where it's predominantly girls, young women, some underage, some maybe on the cusp of legality, wearing school uniforms, that kind of sexualisation of children. And yes, I think that we have forgotten how much of a push there was to include the quest for sexual access to children by adult men back in the day of sexual libertarianism. I mean, we can't forget about NAMBLA, for example, which is the North America Man Boy Love Association.
Man Boy Love Association. That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Supported
they
by
were
Camille
barely,
Paglia, among others. I think she later.
yeah,
Yeah.
she denounced them further down the line. But yes,
Yeah, I
there
believe
were
so.
many of these groups, and many of them were pushed by lesbian at the time, of course now trans, sadomasochists such as Pat Califia, who wrote Coming to Power, the standard bearer for lesbians involved in sadistic, masochistic sexual encounters with each other. So there was such an affiliation from those women were so enthralled by gay male sexuality, and that included some of the child abuse, not just apologism, but activity.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.